With that then, the people may call their first witness.
Certainly, Your Honor. This time the people call Mrs. Edith Morningside.
Let me ask, procedurally, are witnesses already been sworn in constructively, or do we need to do that?
I would say that they've been constructively sworn in throughout this entire term.
We'll do this just to be safe. If I could have you raise your right hand, do you promise to stick to the fact pattern?
Absolutely.
You may have a seat. Counsel, when you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you. Good evening, Mrs. Morningside.
Good evening.
Could you please introduce yourself to our jury and spell your last name?
My name is Edith Morningside, Morningside.
Mrs. Morningside, why are you here?
I'm here because I saw the defendant, Mr. King, shoot Mr. Cashman that morning.
We're going to talk about that morning into some depth, but first I'd like the jury to get to know you a bit. Now, Mrs. Morningside, what do you do for a living?
I'm a high school science teacher at Mother of Mercy High School
And where do you live?
at 89 Lois Lane.
Who do you live there with?
My husband and my 16-year-old twins.
Let's talk about your husband. It's my understanding that your husband is a paraplegic.
Yes, that's correct.
How did he get that way?
He was in a terrible, tragic car accident. He was hit by a drunk driver.
Who did you buy that car from?
We bought it from Mr. and Mrs. King's dealership.
How is that affecting your testimony?
It's not. I'm just here because of what I saw that morning.
So let's talk about what you saw then. On June 26th, 2011, at 4 o'clock in the morning, where were you?
I was in my kitchen preparing some last-minute items for my family's vacation to the big city.
And what happened?
I heard 3 loud pops that sounded like they might be gunshots, so I went out the back door and towards the street to see if I could tell what was going on.
And give the jury some context for exactly where you were.
So I came out my back door and down my driveway, and then I positioned myself at the kind of the edge of my house behind a tall shrub so that I couldn't be seen, so that I could see what was going on in the street across the way.
So Mrs. Morningside, what did you see?
I saw a very tall man who I thought at the time might be Mr. King and later confirmed. He was standing over another man who was wearing all black, and he shot that man.
And at the time you saw all of this, did you know who they were for sure?
I thought that they might be the Kings. Mrs. King was also there. I thought that they might be the Kings because he was very tall and it was their yard. But I had no way to be certain of that.
Okay. Let's talk about your ability to see all of this. Okay. In relation to where you're standing, where were these 3 people?
They were on the King's front lawn, so that's across the street, and they're 3 houses down from me.
So what's between where you were standing and where they were?
So I would be looking across my lawn, and then the street. It's just a 1 car each way street, and then into their lawn, and it would have been a diagonal.
And we mentioned that this was 4 o'clock in the morning, correct?
Correct.
So how were you able to see all of this?
It was still kind of a morning darkness. The sun hadn't risen yet, but our street's pretty well illuminated just by regular street lights.
All right, so let's talk about what happened. When you saw these people standing in the front yard of the Kings, what did you do?
As I was kind of positioning myself outside, I called 911, and I just started to describe to them what I was seeing.
Show and counsel was marked as People's Exhibit 1.
All right.
May I approach the witness, sir?
You may.
Mrs. Morningside, I'm approaching you with what has been marked as People's Exhibit 1. What is People's Exhibit 1?
This is my call to the 911 operator.
How do you know what it is?
Because they're my words, and it's obviously a transcript of our call.
What does that call entail?
Basically, my description of what I was seeing at the time of the crime, I guess.
Did you mention anything in that statement that happened before or after you were observing?
No, it was just when I was out there making the call and witnessing it.
Now open it up and take a look at the second page. And is this a fair and accurate representation of that 911 call?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time we ask for People's Exhibit 1 to be received into evidence.
Is there an objection to Exhibit 1?
Your Honor, we have no objection.
Being no objection, Exhibit 1 is admitted.
Mrs. Morningside, I want to talk about what you observed, what you talked to 911 about. Would stepping down from the stand and showing the jury what you saw help the jury understand your testimony?
Yeah, I think it would.
Your Honor, at this time we ask for Mrs. Morningside to step into the well for the purpose of creating a demonstrative.
I'll allow that. You may go ahead and step down from the stand.
Mrs. Morningside, if you would, please. Now, Mrs. Morningside, I want you to take the role of the tall person. If you could please show the jury what he was doing.
So he was standing with his feet spread pretty widely like this. The victim was laying in front of him with his head away and facing sort of down. And Mr. King, the tall person, was standing like this with my hand representing the gun.
The record reflects that Mrs. Morningside is standing with her feet about 1.5 feet apart with her right arm extended as if, Mrs. Morningside, what are you doing with your right arm?
Holding a gun.
As if she's holding the gun.
I think that's a fair description. The record will so reflect.
Now, Mrs. Morningside, what happened next?
Well, there was some commotion with Mrs. King. She had been sort of running around at the time that he stood up and shot. I would say he shot him execution style. He was standing over him like this, and then Mrs. King sort of ran into him and made contact with his arm.
Okay. Step back just a moment. Before Mrs. King made contact with his arm, do you recall hearing anything?
Mrs. King had, prior to that, said, "Oh my God, don't shoot him," or "Please don't shoot him." Something like that.
And what happened next?
Then Mr. King shot him. Mrs. King ran into his arm and then was kind of, I think, shrugged off and pushed to the ground.
Let the record reflect that Mrs. Morningside has kind of made a shrugging motion with her right arm and indicated that Mrs. King fell to the
To
right.
the ground.
All right.
And do you remember hearing anything else?
After that, Mr. King said to the person on the ground very forcefully, "Nice try, mother effer."
Mrs. Morningside, I know that you're trying to be polite, but it's important for the jury to understand what he said. So if you could, please.
He said angrily and forcefully, "Nice try, motherfucker."
And Mrs. Morningside, you may retake your seat. Mrs. Morningside, what happened first? Mrs. King colliding into her husband or the gunshot?
The gunshot.
Is the person you saw fire that gun sitting in the courtroom today?
Yes.
Would you please point to and identify an article of clothing they're wearing?
He's wearing a dark suit and a red striped tie.
Record reflect that Mrs. Morningside has identified the defendant, Mr. James King, subject to cross-examination.
Record will reflect that the witness has pointed to the defendant and accurately described his clothing. You may continue.
I have no further questions at this time.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor, just a moment.
Your Honor, may I approach the receiver now?
You may. And let me check, is the defense planning on using that particular document in your examination? In that case, counsel
No, Your
may
Honor.
retrieve it.
Thank you.
Mr. Price, when you're ready, you may call.
Your Honor. Ms. Morningside, I just want to clarify a few things about what you saw that morning. You said there was a man dressed in black
Yes.
and that he was lying on the ground.
Correct.
And that the very tall man stood over him,
Correct.
pointed a gun down, and shot him.
Correct.
I'd like to talk about your business dealings with Mr. King. You bought a car from him,
From his dealership?
and the brakes failed on that car,
That's correct.
and that was how your husband was paralyzed.
That accident, yes.
And you blame Mr. King personally for that accident, don't you?
I never have blamed him personally. It's true that we did file a lawsuit against his dealership, but that really stemmed mostly from the fact that the drunk driver who hit him had very minimal insurance.
Yes.
And as you can imagine, retrofitting a house and all of the costs associated with taking care of a paraplegic, are very high.
Now, you gave previous sworn testimony in this matter,
Yes,
and you said that the responsible party had gotten away with it like Michael Jordan on a fast break, didn't you?
I did make a basketball reference.
Michael
But I
Jordan-
really felt like that was more towards the judge. I do blame the judge for this,
Okay. Now, Michael Jordan is a famous basketball player.
correct?
He played in the NBA.
Yep,
Mr. King played in the NBA.
yep,
And a fast break is when a player runs down the court.
yes.
So when you said the responsible party was like a basketball player running down the court, you weren't talking about Mr. King.
I was making a basketball reference because it's true that Mr. King is a basketball player, and also because the judge in that case I knew to be a big fan, and I'll admit that it's not very tasteful. But again, I don't want to say ill feelings, but my blame is towards the judge for just dismissing the case and not really hearing us out.
Sure. So when you made the analogy of the responsible party running down the court, you were talking about a car lot running down the court.
No, of course not.
I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Ms. Ingram, redirect.
No redirect.
Ms. Morningside, thank you very much. You may step again. Give our sworn panelists a moment to go ahead and write the scores.